I'm Mason President Gregory Washington, welcoming you to the second episode of our Future Transformed, a series of conversations with Mason's leading experts about the grand challenges of today and tomorrow. My guest today is Dr. Fernando Miralles-Wilhelm, Dean of Mason's College of Science, to talk about the water crisis and how we solve it. When we think about water as a grand challenge, the first question that actually comes to my mind is water the next oil?
I think it is, and it probably has been for a long time. And if you look at human history, people have been battling for water since the ages. If you think about your first history lesson, water was in it. You know, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia. It's been happening for a long time, and it's happening now, and it will continue happening in the future.
So in the DC region, where we are here today, there have been some notable examples of urban flooding. What is the driver? What's going on?
Well, I think one thing about water that's very easy to understand, but very difficult to predict, is that water moves. You know, you have water in the atmosphere, you have water in the oceans, you have water in rivers. It's moving all the time. It's moving at different rates. So what ends up happening in places that we've seen, and certainly in the National Capital Region, where urban flooding is becoming a bigger issue. We had huge floods in Southwest Virginia just a few months ago, around the major Washington D.C. area. There's urban flooding all the time. Is the fact that that water has become concentrated in places where we have just built too much infrastructure. When we build cities, when we build roads, what we're doing is that we're replacing natural systems that can regulate water flow, that can absorb it, that can prevent flooding from happening, to pavements and buildings that tend to concentrate water. And that's where we're having the problem.
Around the globe, there have been examples of devastating wildfires. And then we see these massive examples of flooding in Pakistan not too long ago globally, and then also in a number of our Western states as well. What are the challenges to addressing these issues, and how might we overcome them?
Well, the wildfires typically originate when the soil gets too dry, and then vegetation becomes natural fuel for fires to propagate. That is what was happening in the Amazon. That's what was happening in Australia just a few years back, and certainly in California, that continues to be the case, right? A drought will very likely result in wildfires spreading quicker. The solution to that is to really build systems that can store water and regulate essentially the moisture content of the soil. Soil is the biggest regulator of water around the world. It is, you think about big rivers, big lakes containing vast amounts of water, but the largest amount of water worldwide is contained in soils. And soils are the big regulator, and natural systems are the big regulators of water. So trying to allow natural systems to store water in a way that they prevent these things from happening is going to be a big part of how we solve these issues.
Given that a sizable amount of the globe's population lives in either climates that have very little water or no water at all, do we have any great examples of water management, any great examples that we can point to and ask the question, how are some of these other countries responding to either flooding or lack of water? How are they responding to it in ways that actually can help us here in the U.S.?
Yes, I always point to the example of countries in the Middle East as the most water scarce, but also as countries that have learned to live with little water in a moderately successful way. So water conservation, building infrastructure that stores water, using natural systems. What's the term these days is nature-based solutions, is using nature to store water. Those are the ways that you can actually mitigate the big peaks towards floods, or mitigate the big valleys towards floods, towards droughts.
Is it fair to compare those entities to the U.S. and what we can do in the U.S.? Is it, in some sense, we're very, very different, right? Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit about
that. Yeah, so that's a great question, and let me tell you where it is that we're most different. The biggest difference between the U.S. and other countries is how we manage water. So let's take the example of the Western states, because in the U.S. we speak a lot about water rights. There's big water legislation that apportions water in a way that does not take into consideration the physical variable. So there are commitments for water to be delivered in places where you just don't have enough water. It's like I've committed to pay you a salary of water where I'm running out of funds, and no matter what, you're going to expect that salary, even though I have no money.
you have no water to give them.
Exactly, yes.
And so what happens then?
No, so I think we have to, in the U.S., I think we have to tune our legislation and our water legislation, and particularly in the Western states, towards the fact that, the climate is changing, population has changed in the distribution, the economies have changed. And speaking of California again, we cannot be subsidizing farmers to grow almonds that are exported to other parts of the world and think that the natural aquifers and water systems in California are going to pick up the bill. And that has to change. And that is happening in many parts of the country, but it is particularly severe in the Western states.
So I would like to now open it up to our student audience for questions on this topic.
Thank you guys so much for taking the time to speak to us. My question really talks about, or is pertaining to, coastal flooding and how much of that has to do with climate change and deforestation. I know there's a little bit of talk about certain cities, such as like Norfolk, Virginia, going underwater in a couple of years or a few years in time. And I was just wondering how much of that is due to climate change or other factors such as deforestation.
Globally around, and that's certainly the same thing in the United States. About 60% of population globally and in the United States live within 60 miles of a coastline. That's where we have built the majority of our infrastructure. That's where everybody lives. And what we've seen historically for the past over 100 years is that sea level rise have been rising. I grew up in Miami, and in Miami they have something that's called sunny day flooding. That means it floods when there is no rain. It's just the water coming up and flooding significant property. This is starting to happen all over the world. We know it is a combination of temperature increase because of global warming. So a little bit of physics. The temperature increases, water expands. So seawater expands, and because seawater is a lot of water, it will really start rising up and flooding. The other piece that contributes to this is that, you mentioned, is deforestation. So when we take out trees and we clear out land, the water moves through the land much quicker. So rivers that naturally drain into coastal areas do so in much faster. So you have more fresh water coming in, sea level going up. The result is that we have a significant increase in coastal flooding around the world, certainly here in this country.
Thank you, Dr. Fernando Miralles-Wilhelm, for your participation today. And I want to thank all of you for your participation in this episode of Our Future Transformed.